So,
Hello and welcome to Great Learning. I'm Neha Kaplish and I'm going to moderate the session today. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very interesting topic to discuss about. It's about VUCA and what are the uncertainties that are going to grip us in this corona world, in this COVID-19 world, and how to actually thrive in this world as a leader. Now, first of all, what is VUCA? I think our instructor today will be best to actually describe it, what VUCA is. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker today, Andrea Stone. Andrea Stone is a world renowned leadership coach with over 30 years of global experience with top leaders across the world. She is currently the founder and the leadership coach at Stone Leadership and a partner positive coach at Stone Leadership and a Momentum Limited. She is also an associate coach at Marshall Goldsmith, Stakeholder Centered Coaching. I have the thank you, Andrea, for joining us today, and thank you for giving us the time for this session. And the flow of the session is going to be that you will be speaking for the 45 minutes of the session, and for the last 15 minutes, I'll be reading out the questions to you, and you can answer them. And
wonderful.
the learners can actually just start typing out their questions, and I'll be curating them. So
Fantastic.
on to you.
Thank you so much, Neha. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you for that lovely introduction. That was fantastic. And I'm thrilled and honored to be here with you all. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about leadership in a VUCA world. And as you can see, in case you don't know what VUCA stands for, it's volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, which I think we will all agree the world is at the moment. This is meant as an interactive session, so I will be asking questions, and so please do type in the chat box. So the chat box is, if you hover at the top or bottom of your screen, the chat box will come under the more options, and just open the chat box, say hello, and please do answer the questions. So let's move ahead, and throughout, I know Neha's curating questions, but throughout, please do write in the chat box. I'll be checking in with that, just so that if there's any question that's really related to one aspect that I'm discussing at that time, I can answer at that time. Otherwise, Neha's going to collect the questions for later. So we're going to actually start with a question. And the question is, how long have we been living in a VUCA world? So I'm not sure how many people are on at the moment, but I would ask you just to reflect on that. And whilst you're reflecting, I'm going to share the origins of VUCA. So the origins of VUCA really come from the US military after the Cold War ended in the late 80s. So VUCA was a way that they described the world and how they would have to be to address the challenges of volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity. So I can see no one's typed in the chat box, which is a bit disturbing, but if you think back, and I know I was at business school in 1990, and we were talking even then about the dynamism of the global world, the interrelatedness of markets. And so we were aware of the fast pace of change and the need to be moving at speed, even though we didn't coin the word or the term VUCA. I think that came in the late 90s. So we've been living in a VUCA world for a long time. The question really is, as leaders, and you're all leaders, how would you rate your ability to accept that we're actually living in a VUCA world? Because if I talk about the people who I work with and their teams, there are at times reluctance, a non-acceptance of the fact that we are in a VUCA world. We are living in volatile and uncertain times. We're living in times of rapid change, but actually humans have always been living in times of change. It's just that the rate of change has increased somewhat. And some would say absolutely dramatically over the past 20, 30 years. So how would you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10? Your acceptance of the fact that we're living in a VUCA world? Because this is actually key, because as leaders, if we don't accept, we're resisting a reality, and we have to deal with reality, right? We can only control what's there. We can only control what we can control and what is real and happening. We can't control something we don't accept. So one request is just accept we're in a VUCA world. What can we do about it? Because that's the best we can do. And so I was thinking about how should we talk about VUCA? How can we make this thought-provoking and kind of prod you as leaders to think a little differently, to consider different aspects of your role as a leader within organizations. And I know the power of three, that's a fact. People remember threes, people can deal in threes. So I thought we'll talk about three things and we'll make them all 3 Ps. So people, possibility, and perfection. I could have chosen a lot of other P's. I could have chosen performance or principles, but I thought let's talk about people, possibility, and perfection. Because as leaders, what are you dealing with? You're dealing with people because people drive performance. People actually drive the organization forward. You're dealing with possibility, and to some extent or another, you're dealing with perfection, perfect products for markets, right? Perfect budgets for investment. It's all about perfection and what level of perfection is acceptable and appropriate. So let's start with people. So how future ready are your people? If we think of this as a VUCA world, how accepting are they of the VUCA world? How able are they to deal with volatility, to accept uncertainty and to handle it? You know, to deal with complexity, to connect all the different dots that are flying around in their environment, and to accept ambiguity. You know, it's actually very difficult at the moment to accept ambiguity because we're just being conditioned to the soundbite, the short info bursts. And that's not really representative of the world we live in. There's a huge amount of complexity that we have to address. So if you are watching this later, I'd ask you to think about this. How future ready are your people? Because that's crucial to your success. And when we talk about people, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about your vision as a leader. Why? Because visions excite people. We're going to talk about how you flex your people. How can you make them flex, stretch them? And how skilled are you at giving feedback? And how do you give feedback? Because only with feedback do people grow, right? We need that feedback to understand where we're strong, to understand where we can be stronger. So in terms of a vision, what are you aiming for in your organization? So what is your vision for your organization? Can you articulate that? Can you articulate that simply? What are you aiming for with your organization? Now, all organizations have a vision, but what is your vision? And what does it represent to you? What does it represent to the people in your organization or the market or your consumers? And, you know, I think back at great leaders. So Winston Churchill, he would say, and a great inspirer, a great vision during the Second World War, keep it simple. He didn't actually use those words, but single syllable words, the simplest words possible so that the most people can appreciate the vision. So I'd ask you to think about what you're aiming for and is it exciting? So is it exciting for your people? So looking at this from people in your organization, we could look at this as people outside your organization, your stakeholders, your customers, your partners. Does that vision inspire your stakeholders, the people who touch your organization? And if we think about vision, if we think about our employees, we know for a fact that people are inspired by vision, by meaning. They will show up if you pay them, but they'll go the extra mile if they relate to that vision, if they see meaning in that vision. And there's, you know, think of the visions that inspire people. Think of the words that inspire people. I mean, the famous ones are obviously JFK, the vision to be put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. There's other visions. If I say the vision of to be the world's biggest bookseller, And that was Jeff Bezos in the 90s. And then that changed, right? So visions aren't cast in stone. Visions change with what the environment opportunities offer and what our customers want. So now it's not just the biggest bookstore in the world, it's the biggest everything store in the world. Yeah. And that inspires people. And that's what we need. And especially with millennials. Actually, also, if you look at research with women, because they're inspired to give more by the meaning in their work. But what's also crucial with a vision is that it's shared. So we spoke about this being an exciting vision, but also is it shared by the people who touch our organization, our employees, our customers, our partners. I'm thinking really internally now within the organization. A vision that's shared means that, yeah, I relate to this vision, but also at my level, in my team, I have a vision. We have a vision as a team. Our team vision is this. Our team purpose is this. And I would encourage you as leaders, if you don't have a team purpose already, work with your team. What is your team purpose? The organization has a vision, but what's the purpose of this team? How does it support the vision? It doesn't have to be 100% aligned with the vision, but what elements of that vision translate to me? If I'm in software, a vision, for example, I'm thinking of a company I was working with, to serve 1 billion underserved with mobile financial services. How does that inspire me as a software developer? Well, if we're serving 1 billion people, I need to make that software simple. I need to make that user interface simple to use. And that's inspiring. How simple can I make that? I need to make it work on low cost devices. So how can I, as a team, craft that vision to share my team and my purpose and my sense of connectedness to the bigger organization? And not just in terms of meaning, but in terms of actual hard targets. So is that vision translatable? So I have a vision to serve 1 billion underserved with mobile financial services. How does that translate into my objectives? How does that translate into my key results? And that's a terminology from Intel, who would always talk about objectives that took a long time to craft, because these objectives have to be communicated across the organization so that we all are aware of what each other's doing and we cross-pollinate and we collaborate more easily. But everything drives up to that vision, but the objectives may change over time, but they're cast in stone for a period, right? Until we know better, until we expand the objective, or until we've achieved the objective. And the key results are very simple. They have to be termed in short sentences. So to serve 1 billion underserved with mobile financial services, I need to deliver faster operating, simpler to use software than any of my competitors by this time. Okay. And I'll know I've done this when I've tested it in the market and it works faster and it's cheaper and so on. Okay. So it has to be translatable. We have to make it quantifiable, right? Vision translates into actions which are measured. I was reading about, actually it was Brene Brown. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she's a researcher. She's very well known. She's written the book Dare to Lead. And she was shocked when she was doing her PhD and her PhD advisor said, if it's not measurable, it doesn't exist. And that's something we need to think about too. We have to be able to measure what we're doing. Okay, so that's around vision, incredibly important for people. When we talk about flex, this is really about stretching people, but stretching ourselves as an organization too. So where can we flex? Where do we need to flex? If we're talking in terms of people, we need to help them flex beyond their comfort zone, because it's only when we're operating beyond our comfort zone that we realize our potential. So there's a famous term, flow. People deliver their best when they're in flow, and you achieve flow by operating not too far out of your comfort zone, but absolutely beyond your comfort zone, because then you're stretching yourself in a manageable fashion. And we need to flex people in varied directions. I mean, rare is a career that just goes vertically up the ladder. In the past, that did happen. You joined as a junior sales executive, then you became an assistant sales manager, then a sales manager, then the regional manager, then the head of sales, right? But now we move around. If we want to grow, we have to move around the organization, because the value that we can add comes from our appreciation of how other functions operate. And it also comes from the fact that we've developed a diverse perspective, right? A salesperson doesn't think like a finance person. A marketer doesn't think like an HR leader. So we build our competencies by moving into different areas, okay? And if we're stretching people, they need bounce back time. Why is that important? Because, you know, if we're taking our high performers and we're stretching them and we're putting them through accelerated leadership programs and they're working on critical projects, they need that time to sit back and reflect and connect the dots. So I always think of Buddha's quote on experience and reflection. So experience teaches us, but it's a bitterest way to learn. Reflection is the easiest and most effective way to gain insight. So take that time to reflect. And flexing is also related to how we operate in terms of hiring our people. Are we hiring diverse people? Are we flexing the profile of the people we're taking on board because diverse teams perform better? Are we actually challenging and flexing our mental models? Are we encouraging diverse thinking? Are we encouraging critical thinking without any repercussions in our meetings? So this is all really important if we're trying to get the best out of our people. And please feel free to ask questions. The other area I wanted to look at in terms of people is feedback. And we can only give feedback if we've set exceptional expectations. Oh, well, they don't have to be exceptional, but we do have to set expectations. And if you look at high-performing organizations, if you look at Google, they won't settle for anything less than 10x. So the way they talk is, if we're going to deliver a new product, it has to be 10 times superior to our competitors. So if you think back to Google Mail, Gmail, when that was launched, it was 1 GB. You got 1 GB of storage. I can't exactly remember, but I remember the 1 GB because it was mind-blowing. I think it was like 10 MB you would get typically from the nearest competitor. So that's an example of exceptional targets, exceptional expectations. And we can only operate when we set clear expectations and we give people feedback on how they're doing against those expectations. And I work with a lot of leaders, and it's something so simple. This is your role. And I encourage them to create a pie, a pizza pie, cut it into as many segments as there are responsibilities in the role, and then say what a 10 out of 10 looks. For this piece of your role, a 10 out of 10 looks like this. To get 10 out of 10, you need to be delivering this. And you observe the person, and then you give them feedback. At the moment, I'd say you're operating about a 5 or a 6. Now, this is what you're doing that's great. This is what I would love to see you doing so that you get to a 10. And this is the way I think you can get there. What do you think? And you make it a dialogue, right? Because it's not something that's confrontational. Too often, if I say the word feedback to people, this kind of defense mechanisms go up. We're afraid, right? Because we're scared we're going to be attacked. And it's a primordial reaction. But we have to overcome that. And I always find it strange that when we were children, when we were babies, we were learning to walk. We didn't, ignore advice. We accepted feedback. Or when we were learning to read, oh, you read that wrong. We accepted feedback. When we got our maths wrong, we accepted the feedback. Then we walk into the office, we get our first job. Someone gives us feedback and it's kind of like, oh, I should be perfect already, but we're not. And the way to give feedback as leaders is a dialogue. It's an ongoing communication. It's upbeat, it's positive, it's frank, it's constructive, and it's frequent. And think about your organization. How often do you give feedback? Yes, we need to have the annual appraisal. We need the 6-monthly appraisal. You might have the quarterly appraisal, but the constant back and forth, that was great. The way you put that report together was precise, concise, and brilliant. That's the kind of feedback we want, not long drawn out sermons and repetition. The other question is 360s. Do you do a 360 as a leader? Do you have a 360? Do you invite input from your boss, your peers, your subordinates, so that you get a full view of how you are as a leader in your organization? Where you're strong, where you could be stronger. And I'm always amazed at how few organizations do this. I'm working with a leading auto-related organization, very, very large organization with a senior team, and they've never done a 360, never. So they've got huge blind spots. And it can be quite intimidating. So I'd encourage you to inculcate this culture, lead from the front. Even if your organization is not doing it, you do it as a leader, because that's the way you get the best feedback. And, you know, you have to help people understand how to give feedback, but it's a process, right? Do you want to know how you're perceived? Do you want to know what your blind spots are? Because too often I've worked with people as a coach, and they've thought they had an issue. Oh, I'm not a great communicator. I've had feedback, I'm not a great communicator. And when I've done the 360, there's no issue with the communication. They're not great at taking decisions though. So this is how we grow, and this is how we grow our people. Now, if we're setting 10x expectations, if we're setting our expectations clearly, if we're looking to grow exponentially, we're going to fail, right? Obviously, we're going to fail. This is part of the VUCA experience, because we have to be testing in lots of different areas. We have to be trying out different things, because we don't know what the future holds, and we don't know what's going to be successful until we try. So in your organization, to what extent do you encourage and accept failure? And if you could just type in the chat box, you know, if you had to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being abysmal, 10 being the best in the world, how encouraging and accepting are you of failure? Or is it a situation where people are afraid? They're afraid to fail because of the repercussions. Because we won't get that innovation and the growth without the acceptance of failure. And I know I've lived in India, worked in India for 16 years. I know it's tough, because culturally we want to be a class topper. We want to be the best. But unless we, you know, push ourselves, push our boundaries, go outside our comfort zone, we don't learn and grow, and we become stifled. An inertia sets in, and that's not what we want. In a VUCA world, we need to be open to experimentation. So we're moving on to possibility now. So with possibility, we have to think about the things that we can control, and we have to be listening. What are the signs? What are the signs I'm getting? What is possible? What's happening in the market? We just don't know, but we can put ourselves out there and try. We can control what we can control, right? So here, I love this post, because possibilities are endless where unity and diversity exists, which speaks to my point about flexing, right? Flexing our people, flexing our hiring, and flexing the experiences that they get exposed to. But what I want you to think about, what are the possibilities in your world? What are the possibilities? You know, in product, in terms of acquisitions, in terms of geographical expansion, in terms of distribution channels and sales models and business models, and the deployment of technology. What are the opportunities that are open to you? Can you share in the chat box any opportunities that you see, any possibilities that you see for your organization? Can you share in the chat box? I'm going to take a moment and have a look. Okay. So people are being very shy, but I'm sure organizations have lots of opportunity. There is so much opportunity that we're spoiled for choice. And that's where, as a leader, the decision-making comes in, the resource allocation comes in, the difficulties of, you know, of moving forward, because we have so many options. Where do we put our resources? Where do we kind of, I don't want to say gamble, but where do we invest? And when we think of possibility, what do we need to do? We need to look for the clues. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what the right path is necessarily, but we do know we can spot signals from the market and see clues. And we do know that we have to experiment. We have to experiment. And we know that we've got to balance our capabilities, balance our resources, right? Otherwise, we're standing still. And standing still in a VUCA world really means death. So clues, usual suspects. So there's some things we always turn to, right? It's obvious we need to look at our customers. How are they behaving? What are consumer trends? What are our customers doing? You know, the demographics, what's the population looking like? Competitor activity. Often, you know, some organizations get absolutely obsessed with what the competitors are doing. If you look at VUCA world leaders like Amazon or Google, they're obsessed with their customers. Amazon is absolutely first principle, customer backwards. And that means think of what's right for the customer and then work backwards from that. Now, they're a thriving organization. They don't focus on competitors because that could be a derailer, right? We want to do something different. We want to do the best for our customers. What do our customers need? So there's ruthless focus on customers. Technology, you know, if you think about the past 20, 30 years, the role that technology has played in shaping our world is huge, absolutely huge. Exponential growth in the use of the internet, in the use of mobile phones. And that creates massive opportunities. Regulation, yes, industries are regulated. What's the outlook for your industry? You know, and the speed with which the world has changed has meant that some of our technology driven organizations, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, have kind of escaped the regulatory microscope spotlight. But that's going to happen. That will happen. The European Union's already looking at that with Facebook. Countries are taking action to fine abuse of dominance. So these are opportunities and threats. How do we handle them? So we're aware of these clues because of the usual suspects. Sometimes we miss the unusual suspects. The clues come from unusual suspects, such as non-consumers. So who are the non-consumers? If you look at India, we're 1.3 billion population. So how many people are you not serving? How many of those 1.3 billion are not your customers? So the non-consumers offers a great opportunity to create a new market segment. What are the needs of those consumers? And I use the example below, serving 1 billion underserved with mobile financial services. So it's an opportunity that many organizations are addressing. Disruptive business models. I'd love to hear what you have to say about disruptive business models, which, you know, look back again over the past 10, 15 years, which business models have disrupted industries? Where were the atypical competitors? Who are they? And reverse engineering, another unusual suspect. We all know what reverse engineering is, but how do you apply it? So I'm thinking of an example from General Electric. They produced a heart monitoring device, you know, to track people's hearts and find if there's any susceptibility to heart disease or heart problems. Now, this was a machine made for the American market. Big machine, about $20,000, I think it cost, could only be used by certified medical practitioners, skilled doctors. And it was in a hospital because that's where people go in the US for their health. Now, if you look at India, rural India, 1 billion consumers, hospitals, not so many. Certified doctors, not so many. So they changed the model, they reverse engineered it, and they came up with a device about the size of a laptop, a bit thicker than a laptop, that was portable, that used mobile technology, that could be used and administered by someone who'd just been trained, not a certified doctor. And it was a fraction of the cost. So I think if you were going for a checkup in the US, it's probably hundreds of dollars. Here, it was $1 to get your heart checked. And I'm thinking of examples also from the UK. So in India, we have, it's given. We buy something online, we get an OTP. We key it in, the transaction is complete. Now, if we look at the UK, never had it. Then I tried using my bank the other day and I found out that my account had been frozen because they've introduced OTPs and they didn't have my mobile number. So that's also an example of reverse engineering, something in India taken to the West. Another example of that, which I found interesting, because when I first came to India and I saw the milk delivered in the little plastic packets, I thought this is very bizarre because we usually have glass bottles or plastic bottles or Tetra Packs. I thought this is strange. And then last summer I was in the UK and I saw it in the supermarket, the plastic packaging for milk. So again, another example of reverse engineering because it's cheaper, right? It's easier to transport. So what are the unusual suspects in your industry? What are the disruptive business models? I'd really like you to think about which industries now are ripe for disruption. Which industries now are ripe for disruption? I want you to really think. Look around. Look at the companies that you use for some services. Are any of those industries ripe for disruption? And I'll share one that's come to my mind. And I know it was considered in the past as an industry ripe for disruption, but I've not seen it happen. So I'm thinking of the legal profession. So the legal profession steeped in legalese, which is not easy for your average consumer to understand. So is that ripe for disruption? Charging by the minute, essentially. Lawyers charging by the minute rather than a package deal. I'm pretty sure that that industry is ripe for disruption, but we're dealing with lawyers, so they're probably very skilled at avoiding the disruption. Okay, so that's clues on usual and unusual suspects. So by this time, you've probably got a sense, if you're looking around, you're taking the signals from the market. I think there's one example I want to share from my early years. And that's an example of, so I joined a telecom company, the early 90s, when, voice traffic was a major revenue generator. And I didn't ever work in the traditional business. I always worked in the value added side. And in the early days, I was in Japan and the internet, there were like rumblings about the internet. And I was reading articles in The Economist. I thought, well, we've got to do something. And I was part of a huge global organization. Lots of different businesses in different parts of the world. Some were opening up to competition and some weren't. Now, what was interesting is I was in the part of the world that we were opening up to competition. But other parts of the business where they had a strong revenue base from voice customers, there was a lot of resistance to self, cannibalizing revenue streams. And I'm not sure if that was an example of people just like emus putting their head, ostriches putting their head in the sand and trying to ignore what's actually happening. But the upshot was those businesses lost the first mover advantage. They were in a prime position. They were monopolies to act and introduce internet services and capture the market, but they didn't. Whereas in the part of the business where I was, we're new. We need to do value added services. We're going to be introducing internet services. So it was a strange and sad situation where leaders just ignored the signals. And that's the worst possible situation. So we've got our likely suspects. We know where there's opportunity. We know where possibilities lie. We know what maybe customers prefer this way of doing business with us, or maybe they want a product that's less bulky or that's delivered more frequently at a certain price point. So we've got some likely suspects of products we could develop or business models we could adopt. And then the tricky bit, because we don't know what's going to work and we don't know how it's going to work. So it's measuring what we do. So we set some targets for these trials. So we have to set up trials, trial products, trial business models, trial delivery channels. And we have to measure the success. We have to define how we're going to measure success, and then measure it. And it's not, I'm not saying by any means that this is easy, it's not, but this is what we have to do. And then we have to prune and grow. Prune, if it's not performing close to the measures we've set, then we have to prune, we have to ruthlessly cut, and then sow that money somewhere else so that we can grow. It's not easy to do. And as leaders, we can be vulnerable to pet projects or our favorites. Some leaders have favorites. It's a fact. Oh, well, he's performed well in the past. Let's give him this. Let's give him a bit more time to turn this around. Or she was a star performer in that earlier role. I want her to, persevere with this when all the signs are showing it's not working. So we have to be ruthless, like the gardener, cut to grow, cut the thorns, cut the weeds, so that the roses can bloom and blossom. And on that gardening analogy, we have to create balance, right? We have to balance between the past, the present, and the future. Now, what does this mean? There's a great book. I've taken it from this book and the other examples I gave earlier from Vijay Govindarajan's 3-box strategy. It's a great book. It's simple to understand, never easy to do that. So the point is, we're performing well in the present. Now we need to look at those signals, those clues, what's happening in the future. To get to that future, we need to analyze our past. What are we holding on to from our past that's not going to serve us? What do we need to let go of, right? And that can be incredibly hard. And when do we need to let go of it? Because we've got cash cows that are bringing in cash for us. We can't just let go of that to invest in something we don't know is going to be successful or not. So this is a balancing act for the leader. And it's a very difficult one. It's one of the most difficult jobs to do because we've got finite resources. How do I allocate them? And the polar views is just something I put in to make you think, because I was saying earlier, we simplify, we oversimplify situations so that we can understand them. But the situation's quite complex. So what do? Let's not go to extremes. Let's look at, the variations along the spectrum. And I'm going to give you what might seem a silly example. But I remember going to one of the hotels in about 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, and they were experimenting. The chef was experimenting, and they were experimenting with ice cream. So it's a 5-star hotel, very nice hotel. And the chefs were saying, well, there's a plain vanilla, which, everyone loves, but we want to, do something different. The other chef was saying, yeah, we're going to do something different. So I'm making garlic flavored ice cream and pan flavored ice cream. And so they brought those out. Now that's not a massive investment, right? But the point was, it was kind of extremes of flavors of ice cream. We'll have the vanilla and then we'll go for garlic. Now, they could have experimented somewhere along the spectrum, right? Maybe a lime with nutmeg. I don't know. I'm not a chef. But the point is, let's move away from the extremes and test out more maybe of the middle ground so that we understand which direction we need to take, right? And the final P is perfection. So we talked about perfection at the beginning, people, possibility, perfection. Why did I choose perfection? I think because a lot of effort goes into creating something that's perfect. And is that what's required? And it may be in some industries. I'm not saying it isn't in some industries. It absolutely is. But there's always, to the previous point, a balance that's required. Yeah. Something can be imperfectly perfect. But the first thing to think about is pace and perfection. What's more critical? Speed or being perfect? And this is what you have to look at for your industry, because speed may be more important than being perfect. Now, in you know, and if we look at COVID at the moment, we're looking for both, aren't we? We're looking for a vaccine, we're looking to prevent COVID-19, and we want speed and perfection. We can't have a non-perfect vaccine. It has to be perfect, but we're racing against time. And that's a very unique situation. That's a completely unique situation. If we think of cars, obviously a car must be perfect, but it must be perfect in how it operates and that it's safe. Does it have to be perfect in terms of the, you know, the dashboard? So I'll give you an example. So as I said, I was working with an auto-related organization, and they had the opportunity to launch a vehicle. I don't know the exact dates, but let's say it was July last year. So everything was fine. The vehicle worked perfectly, ran perfectly, met all the specs. And then there was a discussion about, well, let's create a new marketing campaign. And we just want to tweak the interior a little bit. Now that added 3 months to the delivery time. Now the question is, was, you know, being that perfect, did that help the organization? Did that help that product, or did it hinder its success? Clearly, it hindered it. So that's what we have to think about: the pace, the speed at which we're moving, and the degree of perfection that we require. So obviously, if we're touching up the Mona Lisa, we want perfection. We don't want to rush through that job, okay? The question that for you as leaders in businesses is, do we lead or do we follow? Yeah, your leaders, do we choose to lead or do we choose to follow? Because it's got to be either or. We can't just stand still. So if we're leading, what are we doing to lead? How much investment is required? What's the pace with which we're leading? Are we monitoring the signals for the market? Is the market ready for this degree of speed? Do they want something slightly different? Can we tweak fast enough? Or do we follow? And if we're following, you know, what do we do to differentiate ourselves? We're following, but we have to do something different. We have to do something better or cheaper or more relevant for our customer base. So we either lead or we follow, or we die, as I said earlier. And I think there's a lot of examples of that. If we think of the classic, I suppose, is Kodak. A market leader for decades. You couldn't think of another camera company, right? And the irony is they were working on digital cameras. I think they were the leaders in digital cameras in the 70s or 80s, but they didn't follow up on that product. And even they didn't adhere to their own leadership principles. Two of their principles were listen to their customers, use technology. And they ignored those two. They continued to be cheap and demonstrate their products, but they didn't live by their own values of use technology, listen to customers, which is what we were talking about earlier. So you can't do nothing. You can't stagnate, or else you'll wilt away and you'll be exiting the market. What's this 2 pizza rule? I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but pace, we need to be fast. To be fast, think of our people. How are we organizing our people? And this is from Jeff Bezos, the 2 pizza rule. Any team should be fed, it should be capable of being fed by just 2 pizzas, right? So what is that? 5, 6 people, maximum 8 probably, for 2 pizzas to feed them all, because their culture is around organizing on projects, and you're on a team project. So that team project has to be agile enough to move quickly, to see the signs, to recalibrate, to improve, right? So that's pace, that enables pace and agility. And the other thing we have to think about is the cost of speed. To be so fast, to be the market leader, often costs more than to be the follower. So what's the return on that speed investment we have to think about? Right. Oh, I didn't mention this earlier. But when we're setting expectations, we said set exceptional expectations. And this is an example from Intel. So Intel set, tough targets, high expectations. So what they say is, if someone's delivered to 70%, that's good. Because we've set the bar so high that if someone's achieving 70%, that's a green, that's a go. If you look at Google, again, I'm going to use Google. I've got the Google Mail example. Release and learn. It doesn't have to be perfect. So their Gmail was in beta for 5 years. Their Google Docs was in beta for 3 years. Doesn't mean to say it wasn't good, but they kept it in beta for that amount of time. Might not be perfect, right? But it's good enough. Amazon, they don't do too many tests. They just release it into the market and they see how it goes. And then they, course correct as required. Because it's not life threatening, is it? If they, change the layout on the screen for the consumer, right? If they change the color, if they put some other products at the top than they normally would, right? That's not life threatening. They don't have to be perfect. They're testing, they're learning and growing. They're not wasting time philosophizing or rethinking. They're taking the action. And that's in fact one of their principles, bias for action. Do it. This is something that also is kind of close to my heart. How much time are you spending or your team spending on perfecting when the return on investment doesn't warrant it? And if I think of myself as a leader, and I was in marketing, so yeah, sometimes marketing has to be perfect. You can't send out an ad without, with any typos in it, as a silly example. But how much time are you spending perfecting things that really don't need to be perfect, that your customers wouldn't even notice? And I think there's an example, high definition TV. How perfect can it be? The human eye can't even distinguish some things that are now on a higher definition TV screen. So what's the point of that? So it's something to think about, because it's kind of the 80-20 rule. It's 80% there. So why are you spending, the extra 20%, right? Or, before I shared the picture of the Mona Lisa, yes, that has to be, what's the word we use for, restoring. That has to be restored perfectly. It's a unique piece of art. The Sydney Harbour Bridge, however, does the brushwork have to be perfect? It has to be fit for purpose, right? So the extra time we spend perfecting things, making sure the fonts are all the same size, and that's again back to me. I would spend a lot of time perfecting presentations until one time a guy said to me, "Why are you spending time doing that? No one is going to notice that. No one's going to notice that you've increased the font size from 14 to 18. And that's when it kind of struck me, yeah, what is the return on that investment? There isn't any. So that's what I want you to think about too, because a lot of effort goes into perfecting things that don't need to be perfected. Okay, so let's recap. So we've covered a lot of ground. We talked about people, possibility, and imperfection. As you see, a slight tweak there. And with people, we talked about the vision, how it has to be exciting, shared, and translatable. We talked about flexing, about stretching our people, stretching our mindsets, stretching and flexing the type of people we're hiring so that we have diversity, so that we operate beyond our comfort zones, because that's when exceptional performance starts. That's when people start to realize the potential. And we talked about the importance of feedback. So feedback for people is critical. That is how we grow. Frank, frequent, constructive, and do the 360s, because we all have blind spots. And it's essential that we're transparent, that we trust our leaders. And one way to do that is to share our vulnerabilities and the areas where we need to develop. The other area, the second area we looked at was, where's the possibilities? I'm leading this business. Where are my possibilities? What clues am I seeing in the market? from my customers, from technology, from regulation, from my non-customers. How can I experiment with that knowledge? Where do I want to put my resources? How am I going to measure that? And how am I going to balance what we do now, what's absolutely essential now to building our company, getting the revenues through the door? What do I need to forget about what we do now, what we did in the past? Some aspects of our culture, maybe, so that we can be future ready and VUCA ready. And the other is perfection, because in a VUCA world, it does perfection pay off? What's the degree of perfection that is required, that's appropriate? How fast are we going to operate? Yes, we know we need to be agile. Do we lead or do we follow? How agile are our teams? Are they 2 pizza-sized teams? And what's the cost of moving at speed? Because it typically incurs more cost than moving slower or moving second. And then we have the percentage rules, the 80% rule, the 70% rule. If you've set stretch targets, if you're pushing, then 70% achievement is often good enough. And is it appropriate? Can you jump in and learn as you go? Right? Rather than over analyzing and allowing analysis paralysis to set in. Can you just jump in there? And just to that point, Amazon says the 1 door, 2 door decision. 1 door, you do need to spend time on, because once you go through that door, there's no coming back, right? If Amazon has not thought about entering the Indian market, and then I've seen other businesses do this. They enter the Indian market and then they withdraw. There's no coming back from that, right? There's no coming back from that because customers don't trust you. So that's a 1 door decision. 2 door decisions, they're the frequent decisions that sometimes we agonize over when let's just give it a go. This is good enough. And the 80% rule is, how much extra time are you spending perfecting something that really doesn't need to be so perfect? So that's what I want to leave you with. I hope it stimulated some thoughts. I hope it's useful for you as a leader. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss. I'm with the team. And thank you. Are there any questions? That's what I would love to know. Any questions, Neha?
Yes, Andrea, there are a couple of questions. And the first question is from AC Chaudhary. It's not really about VUCA, but it's about how to actually work as a leader and how to manage your team. So it's about how to give feedback to a team member who does not communicate that much within the peer circle, but always communicates with the higher ups.
Okay, so this is interesting because this is something I've noticed. So leaders typically, they're brilliant at managing down, so managing the team, and they care a lot about the team, and they're not so good at managing upwards. They don't showcase the team as well. They don't showcase what's going on as well, because they see that as kind of groveling or being sycophantic. And then you get another type of person who manages up very well and doesn't manage down brilliantly. The ideal is obviously balance. Now, for that situation, I would suggest, if possible, getting the 360 feedback. And it really depends. This person who's managing well upwards, it's tricky because the higher ups will possibly love them. And it depends what level you are. Are you a peer? If you're superior, then absolutely that person would listen to you because they're focused on managing upwards and getting glowing reviews from the people higher up the organization. So if you're higher up than that person, they'll listen to you, right? They will listen to you. And look at the personality of the person, because sometimes we give feedback in a way that we'd like to receive it, but we're not thinking about what's going to be most appropriate for that other person. How do they like to have feedback given? And typically my top tips are: take them to the side, take them out for a coffee, have a conversation around it, and make sure they repeat back to you what they've heard, because sometimes we think we've got the message across and we haven't. So have them repeat back. So what's your takeaways from this? What how are you going to behave differently going forward? So thanks. That's a great question. And that comes up often. Thanks, Neha. Anything else?
Thank you for the answer, Andrea. So the next question is from Shanky Singh. It's can you talk about some things that your own organization has done to address the problems of the VUCA world?
So I've been a coach for 7 years now, and 22 years I was in the telecom mobile app space. And I think what we did quite well, so we were quite, if I'm thinking of my time with cable and wireless back in like in the 90s, what we did very well was come together as diverse businesses. So when the internet kicked off in the early 90s, we kind of created states or a federation of businesses. So it was a US business, a UK, a Hong Kong, a Japan, the Caribbean islands. It was a massive organization. So we came together and shared our learnings from our markets, right? Because if you're working in a monopoly, you're seeing very different situation than you're seeing in a highly competitive market. So we shared our learnings. And we worked together and we created a common infrastructure. So I think that's key in a VUCA world. Share the key learnings, share what's happening in our market, share what's happening in our business. This is what I'm seeing that might be relevant to you. But the tragedy is when the other businesses, you try and lead the horse to water, but they don't drink, is the tragedy sometimes. I wish we'd been better at trialing things. I wish we'd been better at putting our toes in the water and just trialing things out. I think that if there's anything in a VUCA world, it's testing things and being constantly on the alert as to what's happening. What are the signals in the market? And I'm sure we see lots of signals, but we don't always internalize them or write them down. And I'd encourage you to do that. What have you seen that's different? What struck you? And I'll share one example. Years ago, this will make you laugh maybe. Years and years ago, I thought it would be great if women had underwear that kind of flattened the kind of bumpy bits, like the extra fleshy bits. And I thought that's really what I need because, I've got some underarm fat or whatever. And I thought that'd be a great thing to have, but it wasn't in the market. And then Spanx came along literally a decade later. And I thought that's what I was talking about. Now, I didn't act on it. But they're the things that you notice, write them down, see how it's applying to your business, and look for signals in other industries too, because you can be sure that some variation is coming your way soon. So that's my answer. I hope that helps. Thanks, Neha.
It will definitely help, Andrea. So the next question is from Uttam Singh Chaudhary, and it's about what is the definition of perfection in terms of balance that you spoke about, as everyone sees perfection in a different way.
And that's the point. Everyone sees perfection in a different way. And there's types of people. So if you look at the psychology of people, there are people who are very perfection oriented. There's all kinds of personality assessments or behavior assessments. And there's one type that does love perfection. They love doing a job and they love doing it absolutely brilliantly, faultlessly. And that is critical in some situations. You don't want a finance guy who's not a perfectionist, right? So this is not really for me to answer. This is for you to think about. And I'm sorry, but that's the job of you as a leader, because you know your industry and you know what perfection looks like and what perfection looks like for the customer or your different customer segments. So some customer segments expect more perfection. If you think of hotels, the JW Marriott chain, they've got the Courtyard, which is perfection there looks different to the perfection at the JW Marriott at Aero City in Delhi, right? So we need to think of the customer. What's their expectation? And internally, when we're, promoting what we're doing, we're promoting our teams. What do others expect from us? What does perfection look like to others? And is perfection even required? And again, it comes down to personalities. If we're dealing with other people, what do they want? What's a perfect presentation in their mind? Because it's different. As people get to the point quickly. Tell me what the action items are. And then if I want data, I'll ask for it. Whereas other people give me the data first, give me your rationale, and then tell me the actions. So we just have to be conscious of that and make sure we're catering to some degree to each different type of person who's in the room. You know, you'll have seen people who are excited by ideas, so they need ideas, otherwise they're going to switch off. Or people who are people and they want to, you know, make sure everyone's had their say. So we need to flex. That's to my point again, flexing. It shows up in many different ways. But what's acceptable, what's appropriate for what you're presenting to the market is what's perfection. I know, and obviously you have to be in line with the regulatory stipulations or the standards that you claim to adhere to, you know, the ISO 9000 and so on. So I hope that helps. But, you know, the short answer is you have to decide what's perfection. What does it look like? What's acceptable? Thanks, Neha.
Thank you for that answer, Andrea. So the next question, and probably the last question of the session, is can you explain how time frame impacts the vision?
Ooh, good question. How does time frame impact vision? Yeah, I mean, that's one thing, isn't it? In the VUCA world, the time frames have got much shorter. We used to talk about 5-year vision. And then it became 3-year. I mean, the 3-year is still relevant because we have to put the feelers out. Then the 1-year vision, and then, you know, let's have a look at 6 months because who knows what's going to happen. But I think, you know, again, does it depend on the industry you're in? Because I'm not in the energy sector. I don't have experience of that. But I know Shell used to do like the 20-year plans and what's happening in that time frame, because that's the amount of investment that they make into the future. Is it feasible to do that these days? And again, I think it requires knowledge of your industry. What's happening in your industry? What's the rate of change? What are the challenges doing? You know, if we're looking at oil, and again, I'm not an expert, but, you know, solar power, wind power, electric power, nuclear power, you know, people, you know, if you look at Germany, they had a strong nuclear focus, and then Fukushima happened and they stopped that. So the time frames in this VUCA world are just, again, I'd say they're elastic. They're like flexing. And that's why it's so essential to keep looking at the clues, what's happening in the market. I think the short answer is timeframes are shorter. Timeframes are just shorter, right? So that's why, you know, as the antidote to VUCA is this VUCA: vision, understanding, clarity, agility, the speed with which we can act. And there's always contradictions even there. So, you know, I was reading a piece that, yeah, we have to be fast, but we also have to stop, because sometimes we get that momentum that we don't even stop to think. We're just acting without thinking. And that's dangerous too. So sometimes we need to hit the pause and stop. What are we doing? Can we just calibrate with the market? You know, let's connect some of the dots that are going around in the organization. Do we need to reimagine? Do we need to change our objectives? Do we need to change some of the key results that we're looking for? So that was a great question. I'd love to know your answer to it. But timeframes are definitely shrinking. Thanks.
So
Thanks,
this
Neha.
come towards the end of the session. Thank you, Andrea, for your time. This session was definitely very helpful to all the viewers, and I personally enjoyed the session. And I think some of the insights that you shared are going to be really useful for the leaders of today and the budding leaders of tomorrow. And with this, I would like to also speak to all the viewers directly. In this world of uncertainty, in this VUCA world, it never hurts to upskill yourself, and that is where Great Learning Academy is going to help you. So there you can learn the in-demand skills, and you can actually get the certificates for free. All you have to do is just go there, register, enroll to any of your course, and start watching. Give the quiz and get the certificate. With that, you also get access to all the live sessions that keep happening on Great Learning Academy, like very, very similar to the one that we had today. So the link of the website can be gotten on the description box. In the description box, please do go there and start upskilling. Thank you, Andrea, for your time
Thank you.
again. And I'm very grateful to you for the insights that you shared. And with this, we would like to end the session now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay.
Yes, Andrea, I think the session is over now. Thank you for the
Hope
session.
so.
I really enjoyed, and I think the learners will also be like very, very, very much interested in whatever you shared.